Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the idea of finding your purpose in life. I've been talking about meaning a bit lately, and another way of putting your purpose in life is what's the meaning of your life. And as I've said before, one of the important things to remember is that there are many meanings to your life. That is to say that there are many moments in your life, and in those there are many relationships between you and other aspects of creation. And your actual meaning is going to be specific to all of these interactions. It's going to be far, far too complex for you to summarize in language. So that's something to bear in mind, that when we talk about this, we're necessarily generalizing because we're only able to talk a little bit, using words, about things broadly, but meanings are actually specific. They're actually, real in that sense. So when we talk about things like finding your purpose or purposes is a good way of looking at it. So just to recap, there are two main purposes. You can divide the purposes of human being into two main things. One of them is to love God, and the other is to love creation. Now, loving God is similar in some respects, but there's a fundamental difference because God is complete in himself and cannot receive. God can only be appreciated. That is to say, God can only be enjoyed. One can only enjoy the goodness of God. One can't add to God. Whereas in creation, we can enjoy the goodness in creation, but we can also give to creation. And this is one of the ways in which we are an image of God, that God delegates some of creation to us. The more technical name is secondary causation. But God is the primary causation of all that is, but we are the secondary causation. That is to say, he gives it to us to make new people, for example. He gives it to us to teach people things so that they know them. It would be, theoretically speaking, possible for God to just directly create everything that is and to fill it with knowledge directly so that we don't interact with each other. But that's not at least the part of creation that we're in. For all we know, there is some part of creation like that, but because it doesn't interact with anything, we don't know about it. However, within the part of creation that we're in, it is given to us to be part of God's creation of the world. And so the loving God, enjoying goodness, is another way of describing that same basic thing. That's relatively simple to describe. Love God. There you go. But, pardon me. The specifics of it are, have to be worked out in your own life through, trial and error in a sense and practice. There's not that much that I can think of to say about that part. There's more to say about that other part, the other purpose, collection of purposes of a human being, which is loving creation. And this part of it too is to enjoy creation, to appreciate creation, to look on it and see that it is good. But the other part is to take part in the creation of creation. Through those things delegated to us. And this is usually speaking what's really meant by how do I find my purpose? Or, what's God's purpose for me? That sort of thing. And so it's important to frame this properly, that this is just some of your purposes in life, that you have others relating directly to your interaction with God, and, to taking care of yourself. Every person is, with some minor exceptions, generally speaking, given the task of taking care of themselves, of making sure that, each person is supposed to make sure that he himself is fed and clothed and so on. As I said, there are exceptions where that's not given to the person, but to somebody else to care for them. But by and large, that's something that's important to remember is one of each person's purposes. So that's something to remember. And there's something which is actually very similar as a principle for figuring this out. How can you tell that one of or many of your responsibilities are taking care of yourself? Well, you're the one who can do them. This is one of the best ways of telling, in general, whether or not something has been given to you. Are you in a good position to do it? And this gets really obvious when you're talking about yourself, like who should blow your nose? Well, probably you. You're probably going to be the best at it out of everybody. And so this is probably something that was given to you. Who should be the one to stick the food in front of you into your mouth? Again, assuming that you have working arms and so on, or various ways of compensating for a lack thereof, you, because you're in the best position to do it. This is not true, for example, of an infant. An infant is often not the person who is best able to stick food into their own mouths. They need help, like a very, very young infant. And so that's not given to them at that stage in their life. It's given to somebody else to stick the food into their mouth. And then they, well, partially through what they're able to do with that food, gain the ability to do it for themselves. And again, there are people with various disabilities where this is not something given to them. So it's not 100% universal, but it's very common. Another thing, though, is that you can just extend this and look throughout life. Look throughout your own life and see which are the things I actually could do. And they're not always going to be, glorious. They're not always going to be the sort of thing you're going to write a novel about. But you kind of have to remember, not many people have seen it. I really like my video on God Loves Beetles. I'll try to remember to link it. But God really loves the details. He made so many of them. The thing about beetles, there's a great joke where someone asked a naturalist. The joke is based on some real thing, but that's less interesting, actually, than the joke for this present purpose. Where some queen asked a naturalist, what have your studies about the natural world taught you about the Creator? And the naturalist replied that he has an inordinate fondness for beetles. Because there are just so incredibly many beetles. There are an astonishing number of beetles. And, well, God does love beetles, actually. You can tell because there's so many of the things. But not just that. Look upwards. Look outwards. Look at what astronomy has revealed. Look at how many planets there are. Look at the planets in our solar system where we can sort of only barely tell their details, but they're a full big planet. We're a full planet's worth of activities, given their strange storms and temperatures and so on, go on. And there's not a single human being there to look at them, and yet they happen. There are, actually, I really like I can't remember the name of that belt. The one that, Eris is in. The objects that go way out, farther outside of our solar system, where it's amazing that we're able to see these things at all. And there are some things that are almost the size of Pluto. Actually, I think Eris is bigger than Pluto, if memory serves. But they're so far out, they're almost impossible to see. I mean, our best pictures of Eris are like a small number of pixels large, looking at it from Earth, because these are large, rocky things orbiting the sun, and most of them no one's ever seen. I mean, they reflect so little light, we just can't see them. And yet, they're intimately familiar with God. The dust on some asteroid that no human being has ever set eyes on is as immediately present to God as is anything that we do. And moreover, there are probably things just like this around stars and other galaxies. There are, at the very least, we know there's stars all over the place. All of these things are immediately present to God, though we humans don't find them all that interesting, all told, mostly because we don't even know they exist. Not practically interesting, not hypothetically interesting, that is. And so, if you look at these things, one of the things they teach you is that the details actually matter. We love, because we're lazy, to look at the synopsis, the bottom line. This is, I think, especially true of Americans, but it's true of humanity generally. We like the sort of thing that's told in a story that people are going to relate, but most of life isn't that. Most of life is much simpler. Most of life is not the sort of thing you're going to pass on in stories to your grandchildren. Most of life is just... it's real, though. Most of life is those ordinary real details that you wouldn't describe because they happen over and over and over again. But if you look at them by volume, they're really, really common. And so many of our purposes are going to relate to these sorts of things. They're going to relate to taking care of these little things that no one's ever going to write a story about, but they still matter. They're still present to God. They still are real things. Many of the purposes we're going to have interacting with other people are going to be really trivial things, like, reaching for something on a high shelf for somebody who's shorter than you, or sparing somebody bending down because you're smaller than they are and handing it up to them. These sorts of things matter. These sorts of things are actual purposes that a human being has, and remembering that one has many, many such purposes. And in these sorts of things are where you're going to find most of the purposes of your life. You're going to find, there are 86,400 seconds in a day. As a programmer, this number comes up kind of a lot because a lot of things get measured in seconds. There are 86,400 seconds in a day, and things happen in every one of those seconds. Each one of those seconds matters. And granted, some of them we're just completely unconscious of because we're asleep, but outside of the, 6 to 8 hours in which we sleep, we're aware of what happens in most of those seconds. And they all matter. And so part of finding your purpose in life is learning to stop looking for the big grand things that are going to get stories written about you, and to focus on the things that you've actually been given, which you can tell because they're within your reach. And so, what are the things within your reach? Getting something for somebody, handing something to somebody, just giving somebody a little bit of information, teaching somebody something they don't know, being with somebody. There's often a lot of value in being with somebody. There's also, by the way, a lot of value in praying for people. This is one of those things that often gets overlooked outside of contemplative monastic orders. But there's a lot of value in praying for people, even if you can't reach anything for anyone, even if you have a hard time getting out of a chair. Well, if you have a hard time getting out of a chair, it's probably not given to you to go pick things up for people, but it may well be given to you to pray for them. And so, whatever it is in life, as a parent, I face a lot of this because my children have a lot of needs, and in consequence, rightly, occupy an awful lot of my time, leaving me fairly little time outside of, taking care of them by earning my living and taking care of them by just directly taking care of them. And there's so much to teach them and so much to do for them and so on, that it's easy to get into that stage of, thinking about, what things am I doing that people will write stories about. And the answer is nothing. And that's fine. And it can be it can be difficult to remember that that's fine. But that's fine because all the things that I'm doing are real. They may not be glorious. They may not be the sort of thing that a movie will be made about. But they're real. And they matter. And the people involved matter because God loves all of us. And so this is, I think, probably the biggest thing, especially for Americans, but generally for everybody, to remember about finding the purpose in your life, is that most of the purposes in your life are going to be real things. And because they're all real, you can't summarize them very well. And because you can't summarize them very well, they're not the sort of thing anyone's ever going to tell a story about. And also people will have similar experiences, but they're going to have different experiences, even if there are similarities. Even if somebody else is, also cleaning up, something, doing dishes after a meal for the sake of their children. They're doing different dishes than I'm doing, because I'm doing these dishes that my children use to eat off of, and they're doing their dishes that their children eat off of. And those aren't the same activities, even though we can describe them using the same words. And so, sort of to conclude, one of the biggest things in finding one's purpose in life, the jobs that God has given us, is to remember that God is the God of the real, not of the abstract. Parroting, in mirroring that idea, God is the God of the living, not of the dead. And sort of similarly, God is the God of the real, not of the abstract. We very much, in our modern age, which is soaked in narrative, want to live our lives in abstract ways. We don't want to live our lives real because in many ways, and this is a sort of Chestertonian idea, the real is just too much for us. We want to take comfort in the abstract, which isn't real, and so you only have the good parts or the easily enjoyed parts, is what I meant to say, and not the parts that take more work to enjoy. And real life is lived primarily in the parts that take more work to enjoy, that are common and frequent, and the sort of thing that you wouldn't tell anybody about because they've had similar things, but though they've had similar things, they haven't had the same things. They're not the same because they're different people. And so I think one of the biggest things in figuring out what's one's purpose in life, purposes I prefer, but is to focus on getting over this desire we have to live in the abstract and to live instead in the real, in the concrete, in the moment, in the things that actually are around us, and to learn to appreciate those things and to learn to be content with what we've been given, which is almost entirely real things that are like the sorts of things other people have been given. So, I guess in some sense part of it is learning to be content with not being special. We all there's such a tendency to want to be special because we live, especially in the age of video reproduction and so on, in an age where it's possible for one person who's, a hair better than someone else to, to then become wildly popular. You see this incredibly much in music. It's like the 80-20 law, but with a vengeance, where the top 1% out-earns the bottom 99% because, well, after all, who do we want to listen to? We want to listen to the best singers, and because of the nature of reproduction, especially digital reproduction, everyone can listen to the best singer, and so no one has to, by the limits of time and space and so on, listen to anything but the best. So we all want to be the best. We all want to be the one that everyone pays attention to. And it's important to learn to be content with not being that. With being, when you sing a song, you might have an audience of 1 or 2 people. And you might not do a great job of it, but you still often do a better job than the silence that would be there otherwise. I'm thinking especially of things like, as a parent, I tend to focus a little bit on parenting just because that's what's very immediately present to me. But for example, when holding a very young child and helping them get to sleep and singing a lullaby to them, well, it's a lot better. They want to hear your voice. And hearing the same lullaby they've heard, 500 times in the last, 2 months is comforting to them. And it is vastly better than the silence or hearing some stranger. And so, yeah, maybe you've only got an audience of 1 person who's not even going to remember it in a few months, and certainly won't remember it in 10 years. But that's okay, because it's still real while you're doing it. And it is part of that reality, which, I love this image, comes from St. Augustine's, it's over there on my bookshelf, which is why I'm kind of looking over there. But it's from St. Augustine's Confessions. I want to say it's book 11 in the second half, I think. His Meditations on Time. The great thing, what is time? We can't get at the present, we can't get at the past except through memories, and, all we can affect is the moment, but it's fleeting away. So what is it? And in some sense, we are nothing apart from God, who stands outside of time. And there's this sort of great image that at the end of time, God, creation is unfolding. But its unfolding is fractured over all these moments. And at the end of time, God will gather up the fractured moments of time and put them together into a cohesive whole. That's why Christianity is so fundamentally eschatological. Why Christianity is always looking to the end of time. Because this world is not complete in itself. It can't be complete in itself. This world has to be completed, and it has to be completed outside of time. It can't be completed in time, because time is necessarily incomplete and fractured. And so that is sort of at a technical level, or more philosophical level, why it is, I think, that we are so discontent with the moments. And so that is, however, why it is so much of our work has to be learning to become content with those moments, because that's how we build up that eternity. And so you don't want to skip to the end. It's tempting to want to skip to the end. We're fallen creatures. We want that, the fullness of that completion, but that's not where we are. We're here now. At some time will end and things will be complete. But that's not now, and we need to be happy with where we are. And that's the way to be happy, and also the way to find our purpose, because we're here now to be here now, not to be someplace else. And so that is how to go about finding your purpose in the broad strokes. And finding your purpose is all going to be about the specific strokes, not the broad strokes. So until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.